Dear colleagues, on February 16th of this year, the death of Russian lawyer and political activist Alexei Navalny at the age of 47 in a penal colony in the Russian Arctic sent shockwaves around the world. After the very public assassinations in the heart of Moscow of Anna Politkovskaya, journalist and human rights activist, in the elevator of her building, and Boris Nemtsov, former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, in the middle of the street near Red Square. This time, President Putin's dictatorial regime has chosen to eliminate an opponent who has become too famous in the secrecy of a prison far from Moscow. Whatever the means chosen, assassination, unfortunate fall from the top of a building, plane crash, poisoning, or death in prison, the Putin regime's message is always the same to those who would challenge it. Go along with us or die. The quote attributed to Stalin increasingly seems to suit President Putin. Stalin said, "Death solves all problems. No men, no problems," end quote. Navalny's fight for democracy began with protests in the winter of 2011-2012 when he set up the Anti-Corruption Foundation. This would earn him his first prison sentences. In July 2013, the Russian justice system sentenced him to 5 years in camp for embezzlement and alleged embezzlement, a sentence from which he was granted a reprieve on appeal. Even the judges do what the regime asks. In 2018, when he tried to run for president, the Electoral Commission declared him ineligible because of his previous convictions. Indeed, for the Russian system, he was a tried and convicted criminal. In 2020, he was victim of poisoning, which plunged him into a coma and forced him to undergo months of treatment and rehabilitation in Germany. He knew, returning to Russia on January 17, 2021, after his long convalescence, that he risked prison once again. And that's what happened. He was arrested as soon as he got off the plane. On February 2nd, 2021, the Russian judicial system converted his previous suspended sentence into a firm prison sentence. He was sent to a penal colony for 2.5 years. His foundation was dissolved for extremism, and Navalny was put on the regime's list of terrorists and extremists. The system doesn't pull any punches. In March 2022, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison for fraud and contempt of court. Finally, in August 2023, he was again found guilty of extremism and sentenced to 19 years imprisonment. He was then transferred from his prison in eastern Moscow to a penal colony in Siberia. In other words, consigned to oblivion. But this did not prevent him from being viewed in Russia and around the world as a fighter for democracy who stood up to Putin. On February 16, 2024, just a few weeks before the Russian presidential elections, the prison authorities announced his death. Although 2 months have passed since his death, the circumstances of Navalny's death remain unclear. But for his widow, Yulia Navalnaya, it was an assassination ordered by Putin to eliminate his greatest opponent and critic. She told the European Parliament on February 28th, and I quote,
Putin a tué mon mari. Sur ses ordres.
He was tortured for 3 years. He was starved to death in a tiny stone cell, cut off from the outside world. And they killed him. Even after that, they abused his body and abused his mother. His wife, who is now widow, was threatened through Russian official media that she will be imprisoned upon arrival. Navalny's funerals had to be organized by his mother, Lyudmila Navalnaya. Russian officials attempted to coerce her into having a private, secret funeral, even threatening to allow Navalny's bodies to decay if she was refusing. His body was finally returned to his mother on February 24th, 8 days after his death. For his mother and others assisting her, it was hard to find the locations for the funeral, because for fear of reprisals from the authorities, there was no funeral homes available and no church to look for to hold even the private funerals. On February 27, Vasily Dubkov, a lawyer for Navalny, was briefly detained in Moscow for violating public order as part of the ongoing crackdowns on Navalny's legal team and the anti-corruption foundations by the Russian authorities. Finally, Navalny's farewell ceremony was held in his home district of Mariono, a suburb of Moscow, on March the 1st. Thousands attended despite heavy police presence and the fears of reprisal that many are likely to be exposed to now. As we all know, the latest presidential elections was held in Russia from March 15 to March 17. It is important to note that voting is compulsory and was largely done by electronic ballot. Commenting on the Russian election, our own foreign ministers, Mélanie Joly, said, and I quote, "L'élection présidentielle en Russie a été un processus."
The election in Russia was a non-democratic process that did not comply with international standards. The irregularities included a partial nomination process and the extremely unbalanced media coverage, a lack of public debate on political issues, and no guarantee of secrecy in voting, electronic voting. It deprived electors of a genuine choice even before voting began.
Fin de la citation.
End quote.
Secretary of State for the U.S., Antony Blinken, said, I quote, "Russia's recent presidential election occurred in an environment of intense repression of independent voices and the imprisonment, death, or exile of virtually all genuine political opposition. The Kremlin has systematically marginalized groups advocating for democratic processes and the rule of law, including election monitors. Russian authorities also denied anti-war candidates registration for the presidential elections on spurious technical pretenses and did not invite the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights to attend the election or any credible international organizations to observe polling. These steps illustrate the extent to which the Kremlin has denied its citizens a transparent, meaningful democratic process. Against this background, this election can only be described as undemocratic." End of quote. Despite all of that, Vladimir Putin officially won only 88% of the votes. In other words, despite the fear that the regime has put in places over the year and the lack of real opponents to run, and electronic vote, which is not to be trusted, at least 12% of Russians dared to vote against him. What should we do here in Canada? Let me quote again the answer of Navalny's widow in a speech before the European Parliament. She said, You can't hurt Putin with another resolution or another set of sanctions that is no different from the previous ones. You can't defeat him by thinking he's a man of principle who has morals and rules. He's not like that, and Alexei realized that a long time ago. You aren't dealing with a politician, but with a bloody mobster. You and all of us must fight this criminal gang. And the political innovation here is to apply the methods of fighting organized crime, not political competition, not diplomatic notes, but investigations into the financial machinations. No statements of concern, but a search for mafia associates in your countries, for the discreet lawyers and financiers who are helping Putin and his friends to hide money. End of quote. This is a message similar to the one our colleague Senator Omidvar, who has advocated for strengthening the Magnitsky Act to authorize the confiscation of seized assets of Putin and his allies in Canada. We should act on this. To quote the Honorable Erwin Cutler, Bill Browder and the man behind the Magnitsky, the man behind the Magnitsky acts around the world, and their colleague Brendan Silver, who is working with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights in Montreal, in a piece jointly published on March 13, I quote, "Canada should encourage allies to confiscate Russia's frozen central bank reserves and implement sanctions against the architects of Putin's political imprisonments. Proceeds of such sanctions should be disbursed to organize supporting dissidents and their families, like Kara-Murza, October 30th Foundation, as well as victims of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine." End of quote. En terminant,
in closing, I would like to pay tribute to Navalny, but also to all other opponents, famous or anonymous, who continue to resist tyranny in Russia. I am, of course, thinking of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who, as Senator Omidvar said, has been granted honorary Canadian citizenship by our Parliament and who is currently serving a 25-year prison sentence. I'm also thinking of other political prisoners who number around 1,000, according to OVD Info, a Russian human rights monitoring organization. To all those who are risking their own lives to confront the Putin regime, I say, we are watching what you're doing. We know what you're doing, and we will not forget you. You have not been forgotten. You are in a fight for democracy. Thank you, colleagues.